In the quiet town of Longmont, Colorado, what began as an ordinary spring day in 2015 would soon become one of the most disturbing and controversial criminal cases in modern American history. It was a case that blurred the line between murder and assault, ignited national debates about reproductive laws, and exposed the horrifying reality of a woman's unimaginable cruelty. The story of Dynel Lane isn't just about violence, it's about deception, obsession, and the terrifying extremes to which a person can go when driven by delusion and desperation. This is the story of the attack that shocked a nation, the case of Dynel Lane and Michelle Wilkins. Michelle Wilkins was 26 years old at the time, kind, trusting, and 7 months pregnant with her first child, a little girl she planned to name Aurora. She was excited about motherhood, spending her days preparing the nursery, shopping for baby clothes, and dreaming of the new chapter of life that was just weeks away. Her boyfriend was supportive, and although their relationship wasn't perfect, Michelle's heart was full of hope. She often browsed Craigslist, looking for baby items to save some money before the birth. It was on one of those casual searches that she came across an ad that would change her life forever, an ad for baby clothes, posted by a woman named Dynel Lane. To anyone who saw it, the listing looked harmless. Lane had written that she was selling maternity and baby items because her own children had outgrown them. Her tone was warm, her responses friendly. She and Michelle exchanged a few messages, and Lane invited her to come to her home to pick up the clothes. There was nothing in her messages to suggest danger. The address she gave was a quiet suburban street in Longmont. Michelle agreed to come by on the afternoon of March 18, 2015. When Michelle arrived, Dynel Lane greeted her kindly at the door. The house looked ordinary, clean, with a family vibe. There were photos on the wall, toys scattered about, and a faint smell of food cooking in the kitchen. Lane told Michelle she could come inside and look through the items. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. They talked about babies, pregnancy, and family. Lane appeared sympathetic, even affectionate. But underneath that calm surface, something sinister was brewing. Unbeknownst to Michelle, Dynel Lane had been living a lie. She wasn't selling baby clothes out of kindness, she was desperate to replace something she had lost. Lane was a former nurse's aide, a woman in her mid-30s who had told friends and her boyfriend that she was pregnant. She even showed photos online, wore maternity clothes, and decorated a nursery. But none of it was true. Lane had faked her pregnancy for months, deceiving everyone around her. Her boyfriend, David Ridley, genuinely believed she was expecting their child. In fact, he was anxiously awaiting the baby's arrival. Lane's delusion grew stronger as her lies became harder to sustain. She needed to produce a baby, somehow, some way, to keep the facade alive. That's what drove her to lure Michelle into her home that day. As Michelle looked at some of the baby clothes, Lane suddenly asked if she could show her something in the basement. Michelle, being polite, agreed. When they reached the basement, the air grew colder, darker, and quiet. Lane then attacked. Without warning, she struck Michelle from behind, hitting her over the head with an object. Michelle fell to the floor, dazed and terrified. Lane pounced, attempting to strangle her. Michelle fought back desperately, pleading for her life, telling Lane that she was pregnant. But Lane's only focus was the baby. In a scene of unimaginable horror, she took a kitchen knife and cut open Michelle's abdomen, removing the unborn child from her womb. Michelle lost consciousness, bleeding heavily on the basement floor. Lane then carried the baby upstairs. She believed she had successfully delivered her child. She wrapped the baby in a blanket, but the baby was not breathing. Lane's delusion shattered as she realized the infant was dead. In a panic, she called her boyfriend David Ridley, telling him she had miscarried and needed help. Ridley rushed home, horrified to find Lane covered in blood, holding what she claimed was their stillborn child. He immediately called 911. Meanwhile, Michelle, unbelievably, was still alive. Despite the catastrophic injuries and severe blood loss, she managed to regain consciousness. In agony, she crawled up the basement stairs, clutching her open wound, searching for help. She found Lane's phone and dialed 911 herself. The call she made that day would become one of the most haunting recordings in modern true crime history. Her voice, weak but composed, told the dispatcher, "She cut me. I'm pregnant. She cut my baby out of me." Paramedics rushed to the scene within minutes. What they found was a blood-soaked nightmare, Michelle barely clinging to life, and a dead infant in another room. Michelle was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked tirelessly to save her. She survived, but her baby, Aurora, did not. The horror of the attack spread rapidly through the community. Police quickly arrested Dynel Lane at her home. She appeared calm, detached, and in shock. She told investigators that she had suffered a miscarriage, that the baby was hers, but her story quickly fell apart. There were no medical records of a pregnancy, no signs of recent childbirth, and physical evidence clearly showed that she had attacked Michelle. The crime scene matched Michelle's story in horrifying detail. There was blood throughout the basement, a knife, and signs of a violent struggle. Lane's deception was finally exposed. As the case unfolded, public outrage grew. People couldn't comprehend the sheer cruelty of the act, and the tragedy was compounded by a legal dilemma that would soon divide the nation. In Colorado, state law did not recognize an unborn fetus as a separate victim unless the child was capable of surviving outside the womb. Since baby Aurora had died before birth and not independently, prosecutors could not charge Lane with murder. That loophole enraged the public. Many argued that Aurora's death was clearly a homicide, that Lane had intentionally taken a life. But under Colorado's laws at the time, she could only be charged with attempted murder and unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The trial began in February 2016 at Boulder County District Court. The courtroom was filled with reporters, activists, and members of the public. Michelle Wilkins attended every session, sitting quietly behind the prosecution. She appeared calm but resolute, determined to see justice done. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of premeditation. They described how Lane had faked her pregnancy, researched childbirth procedures, and lured Michelle to her home under false pretenses. They presented evidence showing how Lane had planned to cut the baby out and pass it off as her own. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the attack wasn't planned, that Lane had suffered a psychotic break. They tried to frame her as mentally unstable rather than calculating. But the evidence told a different story. Prosecutors showed text messages, computer searches, and physical preparations that proved Lane's intent. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence was her internet history, searches about how to perform a C-section at home and how to remove a baby. They also found that Lane had purchased surgical instruments and prepared blankets for the baby she believed she would raise. Witnesses testified that Lane had been telling everyone she was due to deliver soon, and had even thrown a baby shower. The lie had spiraled so far that when reality began to close in, she chose violence to make her fantasy real. Throughout the trial, Lane sat silently, showing little emotion. The prosecution described her as manipulative and self-centered, someone who cared more about maintaining her deception than about the lives she destroyed. Michelle's testimony was heart-wrenching. She described in vivid detail how she was attacked, how she begged for her life, and how she crawled bleeding up the stairs to survive. The courtroom was silent as she recounted her story. Even the defense couldn't deny her bravery. In April 2016, after a 2-week trial and less than a day of deliberation, the jury found Dynel Lane guilty of attempted first-degree murder, first-degree assault, and unlawful termination of pregnancy. She was sentenced to 100 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. Judge Maria Birkenkotter called the crime a vicious and premeditated act of depravity. She said Lane had betrayed every human instinct and left a trail of devastation that could never be undone. The sentence was one of the harshest possible under Colorado law. Outside the courtroom, Michelle Wilkins spoke to reporters. Her tone was calm, compassionate, and remarkably forgiving. She said she hoped Lane could one day find peace with herself. Her grace and strength inspired people across the country. She later wrote a memoir titled Expecting Sunshine, sharing her story of survival, grief, and healing. She became an advocate for victims of violence, using her experience to raise awareness about gaps in laws protecting unborn children and pregnant women. The case reignited national debate about fetal homicide laws. Many argued that Colorado's statutes were outdated and failed to protect victims like Aurora. Lawmakers attempted to introduce bills recognizing unborn babies as separate victims of homicide, but those efforts ran into political conflict, partly due to concerns about how such laws might intersect with abortion rights. The tragedy of the Dynel Lane case thus became a flashpoint for broader social issues, forcing people to confront difficult questions about justice, autonomy, and morality. Years later, people still talk about the case, not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed about human nature. Dynel Lane's obsession with maintaining a lie led to one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. She wasn't motivated by money or revenge, but by delusion and denial. Psychologists later described her as suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder, someone unable to face reality and consumed by the need for control. Her crime was both shocking and deeply sad, rooted in a fantasy that turned deadly. As for Michelle, she continues to rebuild her life. In interviews, she's spoken about forgiveness, about finding meaning in suffering, and about the love she still feels for the daughter she lost. Aurora lived, she once said, not in this world, but in my heart. Her words became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, compassion can survive. The house in Longmont where the attack happened was eventually sold, repainted, and resettled. But for those who know the story, it will forever be a place of tragedy. Neighbors still remember the day police cars filled the street, and paramedics rushed to save a bleeding young woman who had dragged herself from death's door. The crime scene photos remain sealed, too disturbing to release publicly, but the memories endure in court transcripts and survivor testimony. Every detail of the Dynel Lane case serves as a chilling reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight, in a quiet suburban home, behind a friendly smile, in an ordinary Craigslist post. It's a story that forces us to confront not just what people are capable of, but how fragile the line between trust and danger can be. Michelle Wilkins answered an ad for baby clothes, and nearly lost her life. Dynel Lane answered a lie she created, and lost her humanity. In the years since, true crime enthusiasts, journalists, and legal scholars have revisited the case as an example of psychological manipulation and systemic failure. Law enforcement agencies have used it in training, emphasizing the importance of digital trace evidence and behavioral red flags in identifying predatory deception. It also became a case study in criminal psychology courses, exploring the interplay between delusion, compulsion, and violence. Today, Dynel Lane remains incarcerated at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility. She rarely speaks to the media, and her appeals have been unsuccessful. Her name lives in infamy, forever linked to one of the most disturbing crimes in Colorado's history. For Michelle Wilkins, her story continues, not as a victim, but as a survivor who turned trauma into testimony. In her words, pain can destroy, but it can also awaken. And that's the haunting legacy of the Dynel Lane case, a story of lies, loss, and the fragile miracle of survival.